The year is 1732, and a 7-year-old boy is grieving his mother. His name is John, and his mother, Elizabeth, was a Christian. She taught him about the Bible, about how to follow Jesus. But after his mother died, his father doesn't continue those lessons. And John grew up to be much more like his father than his mother, at least for a time. 4 years passed, and an 11-year-old boy is taken out on merchant ships with his father. He starts getting into trouble, but does find his way into the Navy, where he gets into a lot of trouble because he tries to desert, and the military doesn't take too kindly to that. So he finds himself working on a slave ship, where he becomes known as one of the most profane sailors around in one of the most cruel and crude occupations imaginable. John is known for taking things too far and frequently disciplined for that. He mocks Christians and the lives that they lead. For the next few years, he continues to work anywhere he can make a quick buck. And then one day, when he's 26, he's on board the Greyhound, journeying home to England when the ship hits a terrible storm. The waves are colossal. The water is rising in the ship. John and a fellow sailor are trying to empty it to keep the ship above water. They work for hours fighting the storm, and finally, exhausted and aching, without even thinking about it, John looks at his crewmate and says, "If this will not do, then the Lord have mercy on us." After what seems like an eternity, the wind slows down. The waves that are rising high begin to fall. The crew does their best to mend what is left of the Greyhound, and 2 weeks later, a very battered ship comes to the shores of Ireland with very hungry sailors. After the danger has passed, John ponders what made him cry to the Lord for mercy when he was so used to mocking Christians. And he reads a book, The Imitation of Christ, and decides to follow Christ, to change his ways, to be a different person. But even in this conversion experience, he continues in the slave trade, which treats people so cruelly. He serves on slave ships for another few decades until health problems force him to leave that for an office job. And in the quiet, he studies the scriptures more and becomes convicted that he has sinned against his fellow human. He becomes disgusted with what he used to do and pens a book aimed at supporting William Wilberforce's attempt to end the slave trade. Even after such a turn in his life, it can be difficult to accept grace after failing so wholly to follow Jesus as to profit off of the suffering of other people. And in our text for today, we find another person, one who had spent years as a faithful follower but failed in a critical moment, wondering what to do with his failure. What do you do when you want to distract yourself? Maybe, like me, you pick up a book. Maybe you turn on a screen or pull out one of those tiny screens that we all like to carry around in our pockets. Maybe you get a sudden urge to experiment with cooking, like I often do when I don't want to write a paper for my degree, or when you don't want to grade papers or do your taxes. Dishes are suddenly much more interesting when the alternative is focusing on something you'd really rather not. And so Peter finds himself in just such a moment. It had been a whirlwind of a few weeks. Jesus had died, and now he's alive, and Peter isn't sure what to do with himself now. So he goes back to what he knew before Jesus. He looks at his friends and says, I'm going fishing. They don't leave him on his own, and so a crew of 7 sets out on a boat as they process the events of the past few days. The resurrection was everything Peter could have hoped for, more than he would have dared to dream on Friday or Saturday. Jesus is alive. Peter had seen him with his own eyes. But sometimes those most eagerly awaited reunions can also get awkward, and they haven't talked. Not really, not yet, and a lot happened in all of the dramatic events that weekend. It's a lot to process, so Peter tries to quiet his mind, and he busies his hands. He's in his boat with his friends, and he's doing what he's best at. Except, evidently not today. He thought it was what he was best at, but as much as he might know boats and fish and the Sea of Galilee, they work all night long and get absolutely nothing. As the sun rises, they're probably worn out, perhaps as Peter wanted to be, but it's discouraging when you've worked so hard to have nothing to show for it. And so as the morning light comes, as those soft oranges and pink hues make way for the light of day, they see an unknown silhouette on the beach. And whoever it is knows that they have not been successful. Children, you have no fish, have you? As if they need someone on the shore to point out what they are acutely aware of, he asks them, "You don't have fish, do you?" No, we have no fish. And he tells them to cast the net on the right side of the boat. One more cast. Now, these are trained fishermen. They've been doing this all their lives. If that is the standard practice, they surely would have done that already and caught all of these wonderful fish. It's easy for a stranger who's standing on the shore, who hasn't been working with them all night, to say, "Oh, just throw the nets in one more time. One more failure won't hurt," right? So they listen. They comply. They throw a net into the sea. And the net is so heavy with fish, they can't pull it into the boat before going to shore. One of Peter's friends says to him, "It is the Lord," and Peter can't wait. Not even with all of these fish to tend to, he dives out of the boat and swims to meet Jesus as quickly as possible, to be near him. When he reaches the shore, he is very eager to please. And so when Jesus says, "Bring the fish here to this charcoal fire," Peter runs and drags the whole net in, 153 fish. And they sit, and they roast fish. And suddenly there's not as much for him to do with his hands. There are no more nets to drag, nothing more to row. It's everything Peter could have hoped for. But as they finish eating and there's nothing left to do but stare into the fire, Peter is silent and can't stop his mind from wandering to another charcoal fire, one that didn't feel so warm or inviting. That night had been dark and cold. Most of his friends had already run away. There was one other that came with him who was able to talk their way into the courthouse, the courtyard of the high priest. Jesus is inside the house facing a complete sham of a trial, which makes a mockery of justice. And just outside the home where Jesus is standing trial, Peter feels miles away from his rabbi, and perhaps years away from that glorious entry they had just had into the city where everyone was shouting, "Hosanna." Hours before, surrounded by his friends, Peter had been so sure of everything. He had made bold claims and promises for all to hear, so sure that nothing could ever entice him to abandon Jesus, that he would follow Jesus into any danger for the sake of the kingdom that Jesus was going to bring to them. But that was before. before the mob of angry men with torches, before Jesus made him stop fighting and told him to put away his sword. And so as he entered the courtyard, he denied knowing Jesus. Being inside the walled courtyard of the high priest, surrounded by members of the very same mob that had just arrested Jesus, his courage begins to falter. Those brave words don't ring true anymore. Peter is afraid of these people, and with very good reason. Still, even despite his fear, it was cold enough to approach that fire for warmth. And just as Jesus is in the middle of bravely facing his accusers, Peter cowered away from those who recognized him in the fire's light, denied any association with the rabbi who he followed faithfully for 3 years, and then the rooster crowed. And now, at an eerily similar fire at daybreak, trying to distract himself from the smell of charcoal with the smell of fish, Peter doesn't know how to begin to apologize. He let Jesus down. He had made all of these promises and failed them by the next morning. Not once, but 3 times. And so as he stares into the flames, his voice is quieter than his mind. And when breakfast is finished, his breath catches as Jesus turns to him. There's no putting off the inevitable any longer. And Jesus asks him a question. It's a simple one, but one that carries great weight. Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? A deep breath. Any rehearsed words fall away. Yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Feed my lambs. Again, Jesus looks at him and asks, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Steeled nerves, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Tend my sheep. A 3rd time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? It shouldn't be surprising. Jesus knew even before Peter denied him that it would happen, but the 3rd time asking the question still stings. Jesus knows of all of his failures, but Peter sighs, he steels himself, and makes a very bold but true claim. Lord, you know everything. All. You know that I love you. Feed my sheep. The fireside desertion and the fireside reunion are stories that many of us know very well since childhood. At times, it's easy to take for granted that they're just a part of the stories we pass on as a part of our faith, and the telling and retelling of the stories central to why we gather here. But not every community likes to pass on stories of how their leaders fail. And yet, ours continuously retells this story of how a pillar of the early church completely failed in a critical moment of testing. This guy, Simon, the one who Jesus looked at and said, "This guy is my rock," completely failed, lost his nerve, did not behave in a very solid rock-like way. He renounced and rejected his Lord when facing the powers of the high priest and of Rome. It is a grace that we have this story, because with it comes this other fireside tale. We get to see that in all of his mercy, Jesus, who had just done the miraculous and overcome death, does the miraculous again and forgives Peter. He invites Peter to recant his rejection, to reclaim his place as a disciple, to resume his position of caring for Jesus' flock. When Peter accepts the opportunity to declare his love threefold, Jesus repeats the words he used when he first called his disciples and says, "Follow me." Few, if any of us, are ever going to find ourselves in a position where there are legitimate threats to our physical safety that tempt us to deny Jesus in the way that Peter did in that moment where he was truly physically threatened. But I think we all find many times in life where it seems safer or more prudent to choose a path that doesn't follow our Lord quite so closely. It is a serious and sometimes scary business following a person who walked willingly towards crucifixion. And yet, it is only through the cross that we reach the resurrection and the reconciliation that we so desperately need. We all have moments when we need grace. John Newton, who I spoke of earlier, wrote a poem that would become perhaps one of the most famous English hymns when he talked about the amazing grace that would save a wretch like him and how he turned his life around. Whenever we do find ourselves having strayed from the path, which leads towards resurrection because of the death and trials along the way to get there, there is mercy waiting for us at the return, just as there was for Peter. Jesus forgave Peter, still included him in the work of the kingdom of God, and invited him to tend the flock. And he extends that invitation of discipleship to each of us, even despite all of our imperfections. Today, you may feel close to Jesus, confident that you are following in the way he would have you go, or you may feel farther away. But wherever you find yourself on the journey, I would invite you to hear these questions Jesus asked as questions for yourself and for all of us. Do you love me? Do you love me more than these, more than comfort, more than security, more than the warmth of a fire? There are two answers you can give to this question, yes and no. And for those who dare to say yes, Jesus has one simple invitation: follow me.